I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dean Reuter, the principal author of the nonfiction book The Hidden Nazi, The Untold Story of America's Deal with the Devil, and editor of Liberty's Nemesis, The Unchecked Expansion of the State and Confronting Terror. Among his many notable accomplishments, Dean was appointed by the president and served as vice chairman of the board of directors of the Corporation for National and Community Service, and currently serves as an appointee on the U.S. Commission of Presidential Scholars. He's also the senior vice president and general counsel at the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies, and has served in the Office of Inspector General as counsel to the Inspector General and Deputy Inspector General responsible for policing the use of federal funds granted and contracted through those agencies. So, Dean, welcome, sir. It is truly a pleasure and honor to have you with me today.
Well, Tim, at the outset, let me thank you for hosting this. This is a great podcast. I very much appreciate your time and putting me on your air. So thank you for hosting.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, today we are talking about The Hidden Nazi, which was published back in 2019 by yourself, Colm Lowry, and Keith Chester. And this is a book that I had read back then. I had thought that it would have a lot larger impact, I guess, than I've seen. And I think part of it was the pandemic hit right after it came out. And so I think that just distracted everyone. So it's great to return to this because the work that you guys did was absolutely remarkable in terms of history and following up on all the speculative leads and all of that. So let me start out by asking what inspired you to take that project on, and what was probably the most surprising revelation that came out of it?
Oh, that's a great place to start. I can tell you easily what inspired me. It was one of our co-authors, Dr. Colm Lowry, who's in Northern Ireland, and Keith Chester's the other co-author. I've known Keith Chester from my college years, and some number of years ago, maybe 2010 or 2012, I guess, he contacted me. He knew me to be a lawyer. He knew I was in the book world. I had had some books published, been involved in some projects. He had been researching this Nazi general, Hans Kammler, who he briefly described as, an all-powerful but all-evil Nazi general of great accomplishment by Nazi standards, who had never been researched, never been written about, was really unknown, but he was all-powerful. So Keith explained this to me, explained that Dr. Colm Lowry was also researching this same general. And the two of them, they came upon one another online in their researches. And after sort of feeling one another out, they were becoming friendly. You've been involved in projects before. It's like you want to make it your own, but then you're realizing, I need some help here. This guy has some information. Maybe we can, maybe our information dovetails. So Keith asked me, not as an author, but as a lawyer, to write a collaboration agreement between him and Colm Lowry, so the two of them could share their information without stabbing one another in the back, basically. So I got involved in that capacity. I had nothing invested. I was doing this pro bono for a friend, writing that agreement. But I had to tell you, my background, my father, my whole heritage is German. My family came to the United States in the 1880s, but still, it's all German. I happen to have been born in Germany because my dad was a U.S. Army officer. So I've always had this fascination with World War II, with Nazi Germany, with this phenomenon, with the Holocaust, with what happened and how it happened, with basically my relatives, in a sense. Certainly my lineage was involved in this. So I had that sort of personal stake in it. And then just the intellectual curiosity to know, could there really be a figure of the importance described by Keith who's never been discussed in history, never been discussed by historians, never been explored? I was very skeptical of that, by the way. And so I started doing some research on my own. Keith had given me the name of this general. They started feeding me bits and pieces of information. And, I went from being skeptic, 100% skeptic, to being the lead author on the project.
Well, and again, this is a great lead-in. I mean, this is such an expansive story. I think World War II is so incredibly captivating as well. So it's no surprise that it would draw you in, you know. So I ended up at this book through Nick Cook, who was the author of The Hunt for Zero Point, and that was a runaway success in at least in terms of the emerging propulsion and breakthrough aerospace communities. He documented so many secret Nazi weapons research projects, right? And then, of course, himself and Igor Witkowski had followed up on this story of the Nazi Bell. And when this book came out, it just took the world by storm, you know? And so then the question became, what next? You know, was there a sequel? And so I'd asked him about this in, I think, 2021 or so, you know, when the pandemic was going on. I said, are you going to do a sequel? And he said, you know, there's already been one written. He's like, and I helped on it, but I didn't write it. This isn't my book. And so he pointed me towards The Hidden Nazi. He said, you have to read this. These guys followed up on all of the loose ends that I had started 20 years ago. So I guess I should ask, I mean, with Nick having called this the unofficial sequel, what kind of participation did he have in this project?
That's a great question. So my involvement in this project overlapped a little bit with Nick's. Nick was involved in the early years with both Keith and Colm before I got involved. And then as I became more involved, he sort of receded into the background.
Okay.
But he was integral in the early days of this. Indeed, when he says this is an unofficial sequel, is an interesting expression. Certainly, Nick is the one who, to my mind, laid out the ending of the story of Hans Kammler, and the fact that there are these several different versions of the death of Hans Kammler, which is no one had researched Hans Kammler. Nobody searched for Hans Kammler because he was dead at the end of the war. In fact, he was adjudicated dead by a German court in 1948. Adjudicated dead as of May 1945, so right at the end of the war. But it was Nick Cook in that great book. If your readers haven't read that, they really should. Who points out the divergent stories about the death of Hans Kammler. And of course, if there are different versions of history, what you can conclude from that is at least some of them are false, and perhaps all of them are false. And so, the best answer to your story is Nick was heavily involved in conceiving of this, in laying the groundwork for pursuing the story of Hans Kammler.
Okay, kind of a handoff of sorts. That was my impression, was that
I think
had a bunch of initial.
I think that's fair. I think this is a book he could have written. He could have been the principal author. He was that involved in the early days, but he did hand it off, and then the story and the research took off from there.
Well, the setup for this, what I remember from The Hunt from Zero Point, one of the few parts that stands out in my memory was Hans Kammler basically loading this Nazi Bell, right? Supposedly loading this Nazi Bell onto a Junkers aircraft, shooting a bunch of scientists, and then disappearing, right? And that moment stands out in time from reading that book. So I did want to follow up on that part a little bit. So again, Nick worked with Igor Witkowski, who was a Polish defense journalist who broke the story on the Wenceslas mine where the purported Nazi Bell was tested. Now, you had told me before our podcast that you didn't find a lot of additional information on this. I'm wondering if you could walk us through anything that you may have found related to this Nazi Bell.
Sure. It's funny. One of the things that Nick Cook has always said, and I heard it more through Keith Chester than directly from Nick, is there's a million ways to tell a story. There's a million ways to tell the Hans Kammler story. And I think the way I approached it is it's going to be different than the way Nick would have gone after it. And we did not really pursue the bell. That was not an integral part of our story. What I was mostly focused on was what happened to Hans Kammler. I mean, did he really die at the end of the war? What was his role in secret weapons? And our exploration of those wonder weapons and the secret weapons tended to focus not so much on the bell because we really didn't. I mean, I wouldn't say we weren't looking for that, but we really couldn't find additional information or a different elements of proof of the existence of that or the purpose of that, as you know. I mean, some people think it's anti-gravitational, people think it's propulsion, which is the same thing, cloaking, other, all sorts of explanations into that, the Nazi Bell story. So we looked, and I tended to head more into the nuclear weaponry, biological weapons, understanding the biological weapons, the nuclear weapons, the bacterial weapons, and the use of those in combination with the weapons we know to have existed, the V1 and the
Yeah.
V2, and then the America rocket, which we can talk about, which was, coming online near the end of the.
Well, I'm going to jump around in my questions a little bit because when you mentioned the V1 and V2, another part of this book, and I would say that this makes it an absolute must read, was the description and history that your team came up with for Peenemunde, right? Which is where those rockets were developed and I believe actually flown out of. And, I've read references to this and even some, fairly detailed descriptions. But I think the way that it was described in The Hidden Nazi made that Peenemunde facility and what went on there, it fleshed it out and made it real in a way that I'd never read before. So now, is that something that like you traveled to? Did your team actually travel there and look at that at all? I'm just trying to kind of get more information about how did you guys capture that so well?
Yeah, I never went to Peenemunde, and I don't think that Colm did either. But we had all the
Mm,
documentation, we had the layout, we had the. I mean, Kammler is an architect and an engineer, so we had the plans for Piemonte. We developed the history of it, really through the lens of the greater arc of history, I would say. It was important to me to go back to World War I in this project, look at the Treaty of Versailles, and understand, and this is pretty common knowledge, that Germany was forbidden from developing all sorts of weapon systems. Now, by and large, they ignored that, and a standing
yeah.
army and a navy. But one thing that they were never forbidden from developing were rockets. And when you think about it, it's because at the end of World War I, there were no rockets. So there was no prohibition on developing something that didn't exist. It would be as if at the end of, the Korean War, there's a prohibition on developing cyber war. There was no cyber war, so you wouldn't have that as a prohibition. So Germany was free in those interwar years between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II to develop rockets. And starting in the early 1930s, they did just that at a very small facility in Kummersdorf, which is south of Berlin, not far south of Berlin. And they quickly outgrew that facility. As you can imagine, these rockets, they fly. and and as experimental rockets, they're unpredictable. So you don't know necessarily where they're going to go. So ultimately, and not long after they'd been in Kummersdorf, they moved to Peenemunde, which is in northern Germany, on the Baltic, on a peninsula, extremely isolated, accessible really through one railroad track, all behind fencing. And the beauty of that facility, in addition to the isolation of it, was that they were able to develop and launch rockets from there and fly them into the Baltic Sea. And they didn't really care where they went. They weren't going to land on a farm or a small town. They were going to land in the sea. They equipped these rockets as they developed them with green dye, so they could track them and then see where they splashed down, and they could,
Mm.
figure out what they were targeting, where they were targeting, and where it actually landed, and make adjustments on that basis. What surprised me about Peenemünde was the vastness of it, Tim. It was geographically huge, but really complicated. I mean, it was a small city with thousands of people, families, theaters, restaurants, fine dining, not just restaurants, but fine dining, um, all sorts of entertainment, and everything a family would need to survive, and including, not surprisingly, unfortunately, a slave labor camp of its own. So
Yeah.
from day one, these rockets were built on the backs of slave labor. So and this is where the V1 was developed. and the V2 as well. So the V1, and we can talk about the difference between those two rockets. They're quite different, even though each was revolutionary in its own way.
Well, let's come back to that. Actually, you touched on slave labor, and I am jumping around in my questions, but that is something I have also read. Like the one that stands out at me is holes or caverns drilled into mountains, and those were dug by slave laborers. And the scientists, from what I understand, weren't treated a heck of a lot better, but the slaves were subhuman, right? That was the way that they viewed them. And so the thing that occurred to me was when it comes to medical research, right, and the work of like Dr. Mengele and things like that, my understanding is that after World War II, the medical community essentially just refused to use or acknowledge that work because it had been the information, I guess, had been obtained so unethically. And one of the things that I'd wondered about was because of the use of slave labor and the incredible losses and maltreatment of, living, breathing, thinking human beings, do we have a similar moral responsibility in some way to some of this Nazi secret weapons research?
Well, that's it. That's an excellent question. We might have a similar moral responsibility, but we have not implemented it. It's
Yeah.
very clear, and it's very clear we did not make the same calculation when it came to those weapons of war. We not only used the technology, we pursued it to the exclusion of the Russians. I mean, we wanted to get every weapons technology we could and bring not only the technology and the paperwork and the samples of it, but the scientists behind it, and bring them into the United States, and continue to use their expertise deliberately. And one of the interesting things was, of course, we wanted to deny the Russians this expertise and this knowledge because they were seen as the existential threat. As we're approaching the Cold War. Everyone in the United States thought that the existential threat would be the Soviet Union. They turned out to be right. So what I found interesting is we're not only trying to exclude them from getting these weapons, we didn't want our other allies to get these weapons. We found about 100 V2 rockets more or less intact as we went
Mm.
into Germany. We took all of them. We gave, like, France one and gave England a half dozen. So we wanted this technology not only an exclusion to the Russians, but an exclusion to the French and the English. So there might have been some moral qualms, but they were quickly overcome when it came to actual German weaponry. And that technology didn't only include rockets. It included radar. It included high-speed switches. It included some nuclear research, but it also included things like nylon and synthetic rubber and synthetic fuels and fracking technology. It was when Germany went to war, this is one of the things that always puzzled me. It was one of the most advanced societies the world had ever seen. So it had technology at its fingertips. Um, so that when it came to weaponry, no, it didn't apply. The moral calculation didn't apply, which isn't to say it shouldn't have. There's another example from the other theater of war, the in the Pacific, where the Japanese, completely unknown to the Americans and the Allies in real time, were running a Unit 731, which was biological and chemical warfare. And
Mm.
they did this. They experimented on U.S. soldiers who were prisoners of war, on Chinese soldiers and prisoners, and even in Japanese villages and towns. They released these elements and then studied the effects of them. We found out about this at the end of the war. You can look in vain for prosecutions of the people involved in that, which is a war crime, of course. And we present this in our book, some startling statements by the United States officials that say, yeah, we're not going to prosecute these people. We need this information
Yeah.
for future use, for our own military and for our own war making ability and defensive ability. We need to know about these things in order to defend against them. But we also don't want our allies to know about these chemical and biological weapons that the Japanese had been using and testing. So there again, the moral calculation was, not only are we going to use and collect this information, we're going to do it in secret. We're not going to prosecute the offenders, but we're going to do it in secret so that our allies don't even know about it. And our enemies certainly don't know about it. So the moral calculations at the end of the war were very complicated. And Tim, I really try to do my best not to second guess
Yeah,
these folks
yeah.
because making those decisions in real time was extremely problematic. I also say on a lot of the Mengele stuff and some of the other medical research, it was not at all scientifically rigorous. In addition to the moral side of the equation, you can make some pretty good scientific reasons to not rely on studies like that. Whereas, the rocket studies, the switches studies, the radar studies, those were pretty rigorous and effective and developed into real weaponry.
Well, you raised a good point, right? We came out of World War II and went right into the Cold War. I mean, and one of the things Nick Cook had described, and I believe this was in your book as well, is the Russians racing to get this equipment, this technology, this research, as we raced from the other direction,
Yeah.
right? And it was like, who would get there first? Who could get these scientists? So, I mean, the Cold War was already underway before World War II was really even finished. And there was so much fear, paranoia, uncertainty, and doubt, right, about who had what and who would be, ahead of the game in terms of technology, that it's not surprising, I guess. And it's worth remembering that this is the same technology that put us on the moon. So it led to the world in a lot of good ways that we have today, even though it does have kind of a checkered past, right?
That's very true. I mean, and this is the technology, to be clear, that not only put us on the moon, this became our ICBM. So this became very important weaponry in the Cold War and even beyond to the current day. People know the story about Werner von Braun. He was the
Yeah.
lead German scientist on the V2 rocket project. That was the high speed liquid fuel rocket that the Germans perfected in the run up to and during World War II. At the end of the war, we posit because of Hans Kammler specifically, we got Werner von Braun and hundreds of his colleagues, brought them to the United States, and they became NASA. You don't have to. You can Google Walt Disney and Werner von Braun, and you'll see pictures of von Braun touring the country, trying to drum up support for public support, and consequently funding for NASA and for exploration of space. But it also these are weapons as well. So he became something of an American hero, and one of the biggest surprises to me in the book, other than in addition to the Kammler story itself and what became of Kammler, was von Braun and how thoroughly implicated in the use of slave labor and Nazi ideology he was, even as he became subsequently an American hero.
I learned more about this firsthand this summer. This is going off my questions list completely, but I worked with the family of an Operation Paperclip scientist, Dr. Winterberg, who was a fusion researcher. He came over much later. Paperclip ran until almost the 1970s. I think it ended right at the end of the 60s. And he came over in the late 1960s. He was a little bit younger, so he wasn't involved with World War II, but they still brought him over because of his specialization and his skills. And it was interesting to see firsthand how that worked. And we were also able to see a lot of his correspondence. He was good friends with Werner von Braun. He was also good friends with Edward Teller. He was a part of that establishment. And most of these scientists did come over and live normal, healthy lives. They contributed to society. They took care of their families. They didn't cause any trouble at all. They were outstanding citizens. But in your research, Hans Kammler was not that kind of a person, right? He
No.
was he was definitely the bad guy.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's true. I mean, the story of Hans Kammler is pretty straightforward and it's diabolical. He was born in 1901 and he became of age during World War One. He had that sort of "we've been betrayed by our own leaders" philosophy. He felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles, suffered through Germany's post-war humiliation and then financial crisis and hardship. And he became an ardent Nazi. He joined the Nazi Party before Hitler became chancellor, and he joined the SS, that hardened inner circle core
Mm.
of the worst, before Hitler became president of Germany. So he was in on the ground floor. In fact, there's a 1934 treatise that he wrote that describes sort of Hitler-like, as Hitler described in Mein Kampf, the expansion of Germany to the east to accumulate Lebensraum, which is translates as living space. This was the idea of repopulating the entire East with ethnic Germans. So it wasn't just conquering territory, it was conquering territory, wiping out a population, and implanting
Yeah.
ethnic Germans there. And in his own work, he envisioned the the killing of 20 to 30 million people.
Wow.
I mean, this is in 1934. This is a staggering sort of thought process for any human being to engage in. And as in the pre-war years, he as an architect and an engineer did some pretty benign things, but became known for being efficient, using reproducible methods of production, assembly line type things. And as the war was launched, he started being enlisted to do more and more remarkable things. He was Hans Kammler, that is. He picked Auschwitz as the killing camp. He designed the camp. It already existed, but he designed the expansion, doubling it and then redoubling it. Designed the
Mm.
barracks. I mean, and this is stunning to me. We have documents, the facade and the of a barracks with his initials on it. He designed the gas chambers and the ovens, and then installed them, and then fixed them when they went down. He was hands-on. He did a lot of his work from Berlin, but he was going to Auschwitz and supervising this work, and then he reproduced that work throughout the Reich, making killing camps and slave labor camps. And ultimately, he goes on to rule Germany's slave labor trade, and then oversees all of Germany's secret weapons.
Yeah, that's just about as diabolical as it gets. That reminds me of a movie, an HBO film called Conspiracy that came out, I believe, in the year 2000, starring Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci. And what made that film unique was it was a reenactment of the Wannsee Conference based on the actual meeting minutes that
Yeah.
were taken there. And if I understand correctly, the vast majority of the film is word for word what they actually said, and they did have some intermissions, right, where they would go outside or they would take a lunch break. There were no meeting minutes there, so they added some things to that movie. But the part that stuck with me, again, this was 20 years ago, was the cold calculating nature of what went into that, right? I mean, you were talking about wiping out 20 to 30 million people. I think that we are all, like, unfortunately familiar through cinema with crimes of passion, right? Where people are angry and full of hate and they want to cause trouble and destroy people. But this was different. This was simply a decision that they made based on efficiency, like you said, right?
Now, that's exactly the way they tried to distance themselves from it and make it possible, and that's what von Wannsee was all about. It's interesting because that meeting happens in December, and then January, and many historians would say that's the beginning of the Holocaust. Um, the September before that, we found an order signed by Hans Kammler identifying Auschwitz as the place.
Mm.
So you can see that Hans Kammler was even in it before the ground floor, in a sense. So he was in it from the beginning. But your characterization is right. I mean, even diabolical human beings, I think, have to struggle with the idea that they're killing people. And in
Yeah.
order to do it, I don't know, I can't remember if I apologize if it was Stalin maybe who said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of truth in that. If you just, can get over that hump psychologically, and that's part of the exercise, I suppose, for them to create distance between themselves and the killing. Um, I think it's as you described.
Well, so with Kammler, again, you've described several different versions of his death, but during the research for his book, you also found that he may have come to the United States, perhaps under paperclip. He may have also gone to South America, and I think a lot of Nazis fled to Argentina, right? Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's the and here I'm arguing against my own interest in revealing the big reveal of the book, but um, we always thought that Hans Kammler delivered to the United States these rocket scientists, von Braun and his many scientists, and we say that based on this tightly sequenced series of events. In September 44, the first V2, the supersonic rocket, is launched into England and Paris. 2 months later, the United States signs a deal with General Electric to build whatever that rocket is, but to build a United States version
Mm.
of it. So that's November of 44. December of 44, Kammler's emissaries are meeting with representatives of the United States and General Electric in Lisbon, which is neutral territory. Even, this is 6 months before the end of the war. While the Battle of the Bulge is being waged, Kammler's, he's negotiating his future at this point.
Yeah.
Then in January, everybody, all these rocket scientists are at Peenemunde in North Germany, the Baltic. The Soviets are coming, and he signs an order to move them to Nordhausen in central Germany. So that's a month after this meeting in Lisbon. A month after that, there's the Yalta Conference, which is where the Allies divide up Germany, what post-war Germany is going to look like. And it turns out that Nordhausen, where Kammler just moved the rocket team, is going to be in Soviet territory. So he moves them again a month after that down to Bavaria, and that's where we find all these rocket scientists. He literally puts them in the path of the U.S. Army, about 2 days' march from the U.S. Army. And so our theory is that he delivered the rocket team in order to try and erase his Nazi past, in order to try and erase his Holocaust past. The problem with our theory is, well, conventional history says that at the end of the war, he died. He shot himself in Prague. Why would he do that if he had a deal with us? And what we learned, what we were able to prove through many documents, is he didn't die at the end of the war. He actually surrendered to the U.S. Army. And we had him in custody for 11 months. We know where we had him. We had him in Central Austria for a while. We took him back to Nordhausen for a while. We probably had him in right at the war crimes trial, Nuremberg, on the eve of the trial. But by February and March of 46, 10 months after the war ends, there's an extradition request from Great Britain, and he really does disappear at that point in time. There is no further paperwork on Hans Kammler. And we do think, and this is where we know those things to be true. That's absolutely true and provable through the documents that Keith and Colm discovered. We think after that, based on some other stories like Klaus Barbie, we think he either went to the United States or he went to South America.
Okay, so he moved around. He managed to dodge numerous bullets, right? Now, do you think that this extradition order might have come in to potentially save him from the Nazi hunters that were around after the war? I mean, if he had gone on trial at Nuremberg, he almost certainly would have been put to death, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think his death was faked to escape the Nazi hunters. I think, and it's and when you stop and think about it, many of the high-ranking Nazis had an exit strategy.
Yeah.
They weren't that they knew the war was lost. They knew they had to do something. This was Kammler's exit strategy. I will bring you, as negotiated in December of 44, I will bring you the rocket team and a lot of technology. You give me my get out of jail card free. And the death was faked by his own driver and his adjutant in order to throw off the pursuers. And we, in the course of our research, we contacted the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Special Investigations, the Wiesenthal Center, Mossad, and the answer to them about pursuing Kammler in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, why would we pursue him? He was dead. We had limited resources. We're going after the people who are alive. So nobody pursued him because of that faked death. So yeah, that was engineered to throw people off. The extradition request, I mean, it's an interesting thing. Great Britain in 1946 is sending us a document saying we want Hans Kammler. And there's a note in the file that says, well, we, G2, American intelligence, we have no objection to the extradition of Hans Kammler. And Kammler had been in charge of, you know, firing all these missiles into London and Southampton. So they wanted him. But it's very clear that, you know, he escaped justice. There's nothing to indicate he was tried. There was no public trial. Maybe somebody took him outside behind a barn and shot him. Maybe he was extradited to Great Britain and they quietly disposed of him. But I think it's more likely he went the route of many, many other Nazis with our help. I mean, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, with our help, meaning the help of the United States, was moved from Europe to South America. We set him up in South America because he was a post-war intelligence asset. It's a striking thing that I learned in this book is it was the worst of the worst, the highest ranking Nazis who had something to trade, typically.
Yeah.
The people in the middle ranks, they didn't have anything of value to give in trade for their life or for their service. They didn't have the knowledge that they could convey. Hans Kammler had the rocket team. I mean, we wanted them. They've, as you pointed out, they've made a huge difference to the United States. And you can imagine what would have happened in the Cold War had that rocket team gone to the Soviet Union.
Well, I want to ask if more information has come to light since this book came out, because again, this came out in 2019 and it's been a long 5 years. I mean, we've been through a pandemic and, you know, a couple of really challenging election cycles. There's a whole bunch of social change, right, that has happened. But there's also been the passage of enough time that I would suspect some of the leads that you had been digging on then may have panned out for good or bad, right? Have you guys learned anything more, maybe enough to write another book?
Another good question, Tim. And unfortunately, we just haven't been fed any new information. One of the reasons we went to print, we could prove that Kammler didn't die when he supposedly died. That he was in U.S. custody for 10 months. But we couldn't prove what happened after that. And we went to print because we had exhausted the avenues of research. We really couldn't go to South America and look for anybody named Kammler. Everybody, we knew this from the records, everybody who went through the rat line and escaped Europe, their names were changed. And then the records were burned. I describe a scene in The Hidden Nazi in the book, where these records are being burned by some high-ranking officials in the U.S. government, including State Department officials. So this was a pretty vast undertaking to get people, Nazis that is, off the continent. So I was pretty convinced that the records officially don't exist. But we were hoping that somebody's going to read the book and say, oh, my grandfather talked about somebody named Kammler, and then find a box of records in their attic or in storage or something like that, that one of our readers would come forward with new information. It hasn't happened yet. I still have hopes of it happening. There are some, a lot of documents were still being withheld by the U.S. government and by others. And believe me, the state of these records it would blow your mind. I mean, some of them are in U.S. archives. Many records are in archives in Europe. Some of them are at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or at Harvard College. They're in small libraries everywhere. They're in private collections. It's extremely difficult to do an exhaustive research. But when we were ready to go to print, we had made a Department of Justice request for records, several of them, but one in particular, and it came back that there were two documents concerning Hans Kammler that the Department of Justice could not give to us. One was created in 1967, and it was 35 pages long. The other was created in 1987, and it was 87 pages long. And if you make a FOIA request, you usually get a piece of paper with a bunch of redactions. They said, we can't even give you redacted documents. We just can't give you anything. There's not a single page we can give you. And that just struck me as curious, especially the dates of those documents, 1967 and 1987. I mean, that's 20 plus years and 40 plus years after the war. Documents were created that late and they can't give them to us. And then as we're going to print, I asked Keith, it's like, renew that document request. And the answer we got then was that no such documents exist. So,
1987, that almost sounds posthumous, right? That almost sounds like a wrap up after his death. Maybe someone did kind of basically a wrap up of his work and tried to organize what they could in terms of beginning to end history. I mean, if he was born in 1901, he probably would have passed in the early 1980s, right?
I think that's perfectly feasible. I mean, I think it could be something like that. It could also be, I mean, theoretically, it could be there was another Nazi trial happening, and there
Hmm.
were records. But how does that lead to 87 pages of records about Kammler?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of work, and your explanation of that seems much more feasible than it's some unrelated trials, just some other Nazi trial that was happening in 67 or 87.
Yeah. Well, Dean, let me thank you so much for your time today. It has truly been a pleasure having you on. I think that this helps us set up and introduce this book once again to people, hopefully get some more readership for it, because the work that you did along with your co-authors was absolutely remarkable. The historical accuracy and the depth and following this maze-like approach, I guess, that's required to weave all these threads together. It was absolutely remarkable. So let me thank you so much for that. And I want to close by asking what comes next for yourself and for, again, this research, I guess.
Well, I mean, Keith and Colm and I have been in touch recently about, is there a sequel? Is there something here? Do we have more documents? There are a lot of threads in this book that go beyond Kammler. There's the extent of the nuclear research that got done in Germany or didn't. There's the idea of a Fourth Reich, which makes a lot of sense to me that Germany knew well in advance that they were going to lose the war. What preparations did they make for that? It's clear they were exporting gold and exporting businesses and exporting talent. So there are other avenues to explore. We're not quite sure what we want to do. I mean, what we want is the definitive information on, did Kammler go
Yeah.
to South America? Where did he live? And then pick up the story there. That's the natural sequel. We're not quite there with that, but we haven't given up either. And I appreciate you having us on. I think it's stories,
Oh,
podcasts like
absolutely.
this that are going to spread the story that's going to lead to the next revelation.
Wonderful. Let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's and a tip of my hat to Keith Chester and Colm Lowry, who really did the real work on the research and everything like that.